Right. Well, good morning, everybody. You guys hear me okay? All right. It is so good to be here. I've really been looking forward to this time. I'm part of the Three Timers Club. This is my third time at Radiance. I've been looking forward to joining you all. As Lois said, my name is Philip. I'm with Foster the City. And Foster the City is really, we're just a movement of churches, a group of churches that are providing loving homes for kids that are entering into the foster care system. We are raising up foster families. We're raising up support teams for foster families, and we're going to keep going until there's more than enough to meet the need. As my sister just prayed here, our dream is that there would one day be a waiting list of families rather than a waiting list of children in need of a home. That's the goal. When we started Foster the City like 8.5 years ago, for like 3 or 4 days, if I'm totally honest with you, I thought we were brilliant. I thought we were pioneers, that we were doing something that had never been done before. We were totally innovative. And then I went on Google, and I started to see, actually, there are movements like Foster the City happening all over the country. It's so cool. Like, over the last 10 to 15 years, there are movements like Foster the City that are springing up, where churches are coming together and linking arms together and moving towards kids in crisis. That did a couple things for me. Number one, I think it's got my whiskers. Sorry, guys. I'm going to try to fix that for a minute. All right. Well, when I discovered that there are movements happening in Texas and Colorado and Arkansas and Oklahoma and Oregon and really all over the country, it did a couple things. Number one, it humbled me because I realized I'm not quite the pioneer that I thought I was. But number two, what it did was it lit me up, because I began to realize like the Holy Spirit is doing something in the church across the country. Like, he is reawakening the heart of the church for kids and families in crisis. How cool is it that we get to be a part of that? Like, here in California, we get to be a small piece of the puzzle of what God is doing in his church. I think it's so cool. So we were not the pioneers, but there were a couple pioneers, and I want to tell you about them if I could. Actually, here's the deal. I'm going to give you some homework first, okay? Because one of these pioneers, there's a movie that just came out this weekend about him. So if you're a note taker, if you got your phone, write down the words "Sound of Hope." It's in the theaters for a week. Go see this movie. It tells the story, it's this true story about a church in eastern Texas, a little town called Possum Trot, who their hearts were ablaze with passion and concern for vulnerable kids. And this little congregation adopted every single child in foster care that needed adoption within a 100-mile radius. Crazy. Completely upended the Texas foster care system. Okay, that's one of the founders. There's a movie about him, so I'm not going to tell you about them. I'll tell you about the other guy, though. There's another pioneer, also in Texas, but this one was in West Texas. Let me tell you about a guy named Bishop Aaron Blake, and we've got his picture right here. This is Bishop Blake. Bishop Aaron Blake was a pastor of a tiny little church in Brown County in West Texas. Brownwood is the name of the town. And tiny little congregation. He was also bivocational, so he had another job. He was also the at-risk counselor at the local high school. And Bishop Blake was the kind of counselor that would have like kids in and out of his office all throughout the week, just needing to talk. And one of those kids was a boy named Melvin Johnson. Melvin Johnson was on the high school football team. Melvin was also in the foster care system. And one day Melvin was in Bishop Blake's office, tears just streaming down his face, because he had what they called another failed placement. That means he was getting bumped from one foster home, was getting moved to yet another. That had happened time and time and time again in Melvin's young life. Just tears streaming down his face. And Bishop Blake, who's listening, doesn't know anything about foster care, doesn't know what to say. Like, Melvin, I'm so sorry this is happening. You're such a great kid. Anybody would be lucky to have you. I wish I could take care of you. Melvin, you're such a great kid. I'm so sorry. Melvin said, wait. You would help a kid like me? You would take care of a kid like me? And Bishop Blake, well, of course I would. Melvin, I'm so sorry this is happening. So Melvin kind of wiped the tears from his eyes and went on with the rest of his day. Not long after that, Bishop Blake got a phone call. You know where this is going? Bishop Blake got a phone call from his social worker. And the social worker said, is this Aaron Blake? I'm here with Melvin Johnson, and he said that you said that he can come stay with you. He said, is that true? And so Bishop Blake is like, sputtered and stammered, and he's like, well, I'm going to need to talk to my wife about that. So he goes home, and he talks to his wife, Mary, and he says, Mary, remember that boy Melvin from school? And he tells her the story and what was asked, and he kind of held his breath as he waited to hear what Mary would say. You want to know what Mary said? She said, Aaron, I sure hope you told them yes. And so Melvin came to live with the Blakes. Not long after that, another boy, the tight end on the football team, needed a placement. And Melvin said, hey, it's okay, you can come stay with us and the Blakes. So, so they brought in the tight end, and then the fullback needed a placement. And then the other fullback needed a placement. And then the defensive back needed a placement. They ended up with 6 teenage boys in their home, 6 high school football players. Listen, every time that one of these football players would come and be a part of the Blake family, before they would come into the home, Bishop Blake would stand with the kid outside on the sidewalk, and he'd point at the front door. And he'd say, listen, as soon as you walk through that door, you're going to be grafted into our family. Like, I'm going to love you, I'm going to protect you, I'm going to care for you, I'm going to provide for you as if you are my own flesh and blood. You're going to become a part of my family. And then the boys would walk through the front door. And that, by the way, was not just some sweet sentiment, some kind remarks before they walk in. Like, that was something that was tested time and time again in small ways and in some big ways, including the night that one of the boys was up in his room playing with matches and accidentally caught his curtains on fire. And within a matter of minutes, the entire Blake family was standing out on the sidewalk watching their house burn to the ground. Bishop Blake has become a friend to Foster the City and has spent a lot of time coaching and mentoring us. And when he was telling us this story, he told us that when he was watching his house burn to the ground, that he said that all he could think about was his wife, Mary. Like what was going through her mind as she's watching her house turn to ash? This was the house where they had raised their biological kids, where they had, countless memories and prized possessions, burnt to the ground. Look at what he just thought. It's like, man, what's going through Mary's head right now? Like, is she regretting saying yes? Look at what this is costing her. Is she regretting saying yes to these boys? It was the firefighters drove off, and everything kind of dissipated from the scene. Mary simply looked over to Aaron and said, well, we better get to Walmart. The kids have school in the morning. So at 2 in the morning, they were just walking up and down the aisles, buying school supplies and a change of clothes for the boys. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The boys didn't actually go to their classes the next day. They cut class because they were absolutely convinced that once again, social workers were going to show up into their classrooms and tell them that they had lost yet another placement. There was another failed placement. I mean, for crying out loud, like they burnt the house down. Right? Surely they'd crossed the line and they were getting kicked out. So they cut class because they didn't want to hear from their social worker. But it wasn't the social worker that went and found them. Bishop Blake went and found the boys. They were in the gymnasium hiding. And he brought them back into the hotel where they were now staying. And he told them, boys, I told you. Like, you were being grafted into this family, and nothing was going to change that. And that night, they had like an informal adoption ceremony for those boys in their hotel room. Isn't that beautiful? The cool thing is that story doesn't stop there, because I told you he wasn't just a foster dad and a counselor, he was also a pastor at a church. So after all of this experience, and he began to realize that there were kids in his neighborhood, in his community, that were in desperate need of love and care and attachment and stability. And so he stood in front of his congregation, tiny little congregation, one Sunday morning. And he said, guys, we have young neighbors in our community that have gone through heart-wrenching crisis and trauma, and there are not nearly enough families ready to care for them. This is the question he asked his congregation. He said, who will stand with us for these kids? Who will stand with us for these kids? And you know what? A woman stood up. That morning, as he's preaching, she said, I will, Bishop. And then another woman stood up. She said, I will, Bishop. And then another person stood up, and another person stood up. From their tiny little congregation, they found 15 new foster families. Within a matter of months, 39 children from the foster care system were a part of their congregation. What was happening in that church began to spread around to other churches. They began to see what was happening. They said, we want in. We want to be a part of that. And in 2004, they got to this place where there was actually a waiting list of families rather than a waiting list of kids. And they've worked together year after year after year to make sure it stays that way. Those are the pioneers. That's the pioneer. Those are the footsteps that we follow. What I love about this vision of Foster the City and what Lois and Ryan and others are a part of, is this isn't, it's doable. We can do it. We can do it. And the watching world can see it. They can see the gospel lived out in such a practical, potent way. You know, as I tell you that story about Bishop Blake, I don't know most of you, granted, but I would put money that there is not a person in this room or a person watching online, a person that just heard that story that thought to themselves, what a fool. I mean, the guy, he lost his house. What a fool he was to say yes to those boys. Not one of you thought that. You know, I bet what, for many of you, what actually went through your mind and your heart was, man, that's inspiring. Man, that is a life well lived. I want to live a life like that. Am I right? I know that about you because that's what you were made for, and that's what I was made for. That's what we were created in Christ Jesus for good works. This month at Radiance, you know, you all are spending time, you know, as focusing kind of on how you're living life together on mission, and I love that because that's what you were created. You were made for mission. Remember, God told Abraham, "I'm going to bless you that you might be a blessing." So I want to kind of double down on this just for a minute. If you could, I want to take a look at one other story, and it's out of Luke chapter 10, and I think it's really actually honestly similar to the Blake's story. So if you have a Bible with you, you can open up Luke chapter 10. You can open up your phones, or you can just follow along here on the screen. Can I just interrupt everybody? Is this super distracting? Should we grab a handheld, maybe? Thank you. Appreciate it. Awesome. There we go. Give me 1 minute. I'm not sure what I was thinking here. There we go. Awesome, thank you. All right. Everybody up to Luke 10? Here we go. Luke chapter 10, verse 25. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? Jesus replied. How do you read it? So he answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. You've answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you'll live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, well, who's my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes. They beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Okay, 3 things I want to pull out of this parable today. First two are pretty straightforward. The third one is something that I'm just beginning to kind of wrap my head around that's helping me to look at this parable like I never have before. The first, though, Jesus gives us a mandate. He gives us a mandate. And it's very simple. It's to open our eyes, just to see and to have compassion. To see and to have compassion. Jesus says first that a priest and a Levite come down the road and they see the man. They see the man, but what they saw did not move them towards pity or compassion. In fact, they went out of their way to avoid the man who was in need. This is heartbreaking, of course, because this is not just a couple of random. He didn't just say a couple of guys walked by. He says a priest and a Levite. That's important. What is he saying? Well, these are varsity level religious leaders. Better than anybody else, they knew the scriptures. They would have had massive chunks of the scriptures memorized, committed to memory. They knew better than anybody what God's heart was towards the vulnerable, and yet what they knew about God was not transforming them to become people like God. Their religion was abstract, disembodied knowledge, not something that was transforming them into people of love and action. I think about it like this. I'm a big Bay Area sports fan, like the young guy you talked about who loves the Warriors. I'm a big Warriors fan. If anyone wants to talk off-season signs and trades and all that stuff with me at the table, let's do it. I want to hear what you think. I love Warriors. I love the Giants. I love the Niners. I love watching sports. I have 4 kids at home. I love watching sports with my kids. My 10-year-old in particular, because he loves about it just as much as I do. The thing I love watching with my 10-year-old, though, like, we've never made it through a Niners game. We haven't even made it to halftime. We've never made it past halftime where my 10-year-old won't say, "Hey, Dad, can we go play catch? Dad, can we go play football? Can we go play the game?" Like, he gets so inspired watching the game that he just has to go out and do it. At some point, we lose that, though, don't we? And we kind of just get content just sitting on the couch and observing and, like, learning the players' names and wearing the jerseys. And, we wear the right colors and we learn the stats and the nuance of the game and the plays and, all the team drama. Like, we just get content just observing it, watching it happen. It's kind of like that sometimes with our faith, though, too, isn't it? Like, we get content singing about it and preaching about it and talking about it. And that's what was happening was that this priest and these Levites, they knew the characters in the scriptures. They had this stuff memorized. They could talk about it. They could sing about it. They could debate about it. But they weren't doing it. At some point, they'd lost it. Their abstract knowledge was not moving them to concrete love or action. May that not be true of us. Martin Luther King Jr. said it like this. He said, "In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard so many ministers say, oh, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. And I have watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which made a strange distinction between body and soul, the sacred and the secular." Can I tell you what he's saying? Jesus didn't just come to preach about the poor, or even to preach to the poor. He also came to lift up the poor. A disembodied, abstract faith is not found in the Bible. Our faith is something that is lived out on the ground, in the streets, in our homes, in our workplaces, in our schools. And the author, Jason Johnson, he says it like this, and by the way, if this doesn't get you riled up, I don't know what will. This is what he says. He says, "We cannot rightly raise our hands in worship of a God that steps towards us in our hard and broken, and then use those same hands to push the hard and broken of others away." So the question is, what will we do with what we see right in front of us? And I'm going to lean into foster care, but this is true also of those who are in your life who are struggling. Marriage is struggling. People are falling apart financially. People are falling apart emotionally. What will we do when we see someone who's in need in front of us? But there is a crisis in the foster care system in the Bay Area. And across all 10 Bay Area counties, we have a shortage of foster families, but it is nowhere more intense than right here in San Francisco. 60% of the kids that enter into the foster care system here in the city have to be sent out of the county due to a shortage of foster homes. 60%. Oftentimes more than 100 miles away. The further that a child is removed from their biological family, the less likely it is that they're going to be restored with their biological family. We know that statistically. One of our team members just spoke at a church in Merced. And she said a woman came up after the service and told her, she said, I'm fostering a kid right now from San Francisco. And she said, I cannot tell you how difficult it is to facilitate connection and relationship with the biological family. It's so hard to be able to get those families restored back. We serve a God that loves to restore things that are broken, who's just passionate about seeing broken things restored and made new. We are called to be agents of reconciliation with him, aren't we? So I'm just going to be frank. The fact that somebody else in some other part of California is having to love your neighbor, there's something fundamentally broken about that. And that's true where I live too. There's something fundamentally broken. We hear numbers like, 60% and kids being sent out, or you hear, that there are maybe 400,000 kids in foster care across the country, or 5,000 to 6,000 right here in the Bay Area. Sometimes it's hard to move past the fact that those are numbers, that those are percentages, those are stats. Can I put some flesh on that for us for a minute? Let me tell you about a couple of kids I heard about recently from an agency leader. This is down south. This agency leader told us about a 3-year-old little boy and an 8-year-old little girl. This brother and sister have been in a government facility for 9 months because they can't find family for them. A 3-year-old little boy and an 8-year-old little girl, 9 months without family. The 3-year-old little boy is so developmentally delayed, he has yet to walk. The 8-year-old little girl, the agency leader told us, the 8-year-old little girl doesn't know how to play. She won't play with toys. She won't play on the playground. Because she's had to take care of her sibling, had to be mom to her sibling for so long, her brain has been wired to be caregiver rather than child. There are kids like this in our community. The question is, who will open up their home? Who will answer the phone call from the social worker? Who will open up their home and teach this little boy how to walk and teach this little girl how to be a child? What will we see with what will we do with what we see in front of us? Would you be willing to ask God to open your eyes to the vulnerable, whether it's a kid in foster care or it's a person sitting next to you that's walking through depression right now? What will you do with what you see in front of you? Jesus is calling you and me to see and move towards the need, and that's exactly what the Good Samaritan does. I want to take a minute. I want to we looked at the mandate. It's to see and have compassion. The second, though, is we're going to look at the measure of his love. We saw the mandate. Let's look at the measure. Let me give a little clarity here for a minute. So this story that Jesus is sharing, this story of the Good Samaritan, it's a parable, which means it wasn't true. It didn't actually happen. We get that, right? So this is a fictional story told to convey some truths. The interesting thing about this specific parable, though, is Jesus tells this fictional story in a real place. He actually places the story in an actual geographical setting that many of his listeners would have been familiar with. He says this took place between the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And that was an infamous stretch of road. They called it the Bloody Way, or the Path of Blood. That's what it was known as at the time, because it was so common for people to get jumped on this stretch of road. So Jesus, who is so intentional, places this scene right here. So my guess is that many of the listeners, as they hear that this priest and Levite quickly skirted on by when they saw the man who was half dead, probably thought, well, that's just good common sense. There's robbers that might still, be still nearby if the guy's still alive, and maybe this is a trap, in fact. Of course they're going to pick up the pace. So what is Jesus telling us then? When he celebrates the fact that the Samaritan would stop and get down in the dirt and help the man. Could it be that what he's telling us is, I'm asking you to inconvenience yourself or even possibly put yourself in harm's way if that's what your neighbor requires? I'm asking you to inconvenience yourself or even potentially put yourself in harm's way if that's what your neighbor needs. This is so counterintuitive, isn't it? to a culture that so values self-preservation, individualism, right? Looking out for number one. When we see often a need in front of us, again, whether it's just the person who wants to talk because they just got in a fight with their spouse, or if it's a kid in foster care, oftentimes we do this cost analysis in our mind. If I say yes and I move towards this person who's struggling, what will this cost me? How long is this phone call going to be? How will this impact my time, my resources, my sense of safety, my sense of security, my plans, my ambitions? What will this cost me? And we hear this all the time around foster care. When we have these conversations, they say, gosh, but isn't it hard? Like, what if the kid that comes into your home, like, what if they've gone through some trauma? What if they act out of that trauma? Isn't that difficult? And do you want to know the answer to that? Yes, it's very difficult. Do the kids always act out? Absolutely not. But sometimes that can be the case. Here's the deal, though. We all act out of the trauma we've experienced to some degree. And our life is, our spiritual journey is oftentimes like a journey of healing from that. We get the opportunity to walk with the kids and healing from that. But can it be hard? Absolutely. Or people will say, man, I couldn't welcome in a kiddo because I couldn't say goodbye. Like, I'll get attached to them. How could I say goodbye to a child that's becoming like a part of my family? Isn't that hard? You want to know the answer to that? Yes, it's very, very hard. The first little girl that we brought into our home, she was 4 months old. We had her for about a year. Fell in love with this little girl. Very quickly became like a sister to my biological kids. And her first words was calling me Dada. That was her first word. Because that's what she heard my biological kids calling me. She took her first steps in our living room. Fell in love with this beautiful little girl. But over that year that we were also getting to know this little one and falling in love with her and her becoming an important part of our family, we were also getting to know her biological parents. And we were watching them take every step that they needed to be able to bring their little girl back. They'd made some mistakes, but they were doing everything they could to bring their little girl back home. And so after a year, I remember handing this little girl back into the arms of her dad at my front door. My oldest son was 7 at the time. He said it was the first time he'd ever seen me cry. Now I cry all the time. But I think I've cried 4 times this morning already. But of course it's hard. But we don't show compassion because it makes us feel good. That's not the point. Compassion's not about me, it's not about you. Friends, surely your life was meant to be more than just about getting to the finish line as safely and comfortably as possible. Can I say that again? I feel like I need to hear that, so I'm going to say it one more time. Surely my life was meant to be more than just about getting to the finish line as safely and comfortably as possible. Can I actually share one more story with you? I'm going to invite you to watch this video. This is my friend Ryan. As he kind of wrestled through some of these same questions, I want you to hear his story.
I want to take a minute to tell you the story of how my wife led our family into foster care. Growing up, I had no aspirations to be an adoptive dad or a foster parent. To tell you the truth, I didn't even know what foster care was. My wife, on the other hand, had decided that she was going to adopt a child before she entered middle school. I still remember the day that she came to me and she asked me, "What do you think about becoming foster parents?" At first, I was very hesitant about the idea. I was not interested in signing up right away to welcome children into our life from hard places. And I think one of the main reasons is I couldn't wrap my head around the concept of pouring myself out for a child only to have them leave our home. Yet after a while and her persistence, I agreed to go to an orientation to learn more about what fostering was all about. And I remember at the orientation, they shared stories and statistics of kids who were in care. Some of those statistics really cut straight to my heart. Shortly after, we found out about a 23-year-old who needed a place to stay. And my wife, yet again, convinced me that we should open up our home to this young man. As we heard his story and got to know him, we found out some heartbreaking details about his journey into foster care. When he was 14 years old, he was part of this horrific event that resulted in his entire family dying except for him. He was the only one who survived. And that event led him to enter into foster care. And the thing about his story that made me the most angry, that broke my heart the most, is that this boy at 14 years old, after going through one of the worst things I can imagine, being in foster care, there was no family available to take care of him. He ended up staying in a group home for his entire adolescence. I remember one day sitting with him. We were actually driving in the car. I know exactly the street we were on, and I asked him about why he played so many video games. And I'll never forget his answer. He said, "Well, I don't really like this world. And when I play video games, I'm taken to a place where nobody can hurt me." Hearing those words in that moment, all of my hesitation about becoming a foster parent melted away, and I was left sitting with a little boy who needed a home. The truth is, I'm not alone in my hesitation to become a foster dad. Many husbands are hesitant to follow their wives' calling to foster children. Addressing this issue, author and foster parent Jason Johnson says this: "Some will say it's important that both the husband and wife feel called, and I would wholeheartedly agree. That is, after all, the point. Perhaps God is making that call very clear to you through your wife." The truth is that there are many husbands who are hesitant to follow their wives leading into foster care. And this is really tragic because the need for godly men to step into these children's lives is massive. One national study found that 46% of children involved in the foster care system had not seen their fathers in the last year. Yet study after study suggests that children with involved, loving fathers are significantly more likely to do well in school, to have healthy self-esteem, to exhibit empathy, even to avoid high-risk behaviors like drug use and criminal activity. Foster dads have a unique opportunity to be present and committed to children who need fathering, and in doing so, they can make a significant difference in that child's life. Most of the children I've fostered have moved on from my home, but I am so grateful that at such a crucial and vulnerable time in their life, God allowed me to play a role in making sure that these children knew how much God loved them. To find out how you can make a difference in a child's life, head to fosterthecity.org and sign up to attend an interest meeting today.
I'll say it again. Our lives are meant to be more than getting to the finish line as safely and comfortably as possible. The Samaritan took what he had. He saw the man in need. He moved towards him in compassion, and he extravagantly gave of his resources. We're told that he gets down into the dirt with him. And the Samaritan takes his wine and his oil, and he cleans and disinfects the wound. That's what he would have done with the wine and the oil. And then he binds the body of the man and puts him on his own donkey and takes him to the inn where he is taken care of, and he gives 2 denarii. That's not chump change, guys. That's 2 months' rent. 2 denarii to the innkeeper, and says, make sure he's got everything he needs, all the time and resources that he needs to be restored fully. What is God calling you to give? What resources at the time? Maybe it is what Ryan shared. Maybe it is considering actually opening up your home to a child in need. As if I haven't made it clear enough, there's a profound need for more foster families here in the Bay Area. Maybe that is something that God is calling you to consider. We need people who are single. We need people who are empty nesters. We need married couples with children, and we need married couples without children. Is there anybody I left out? Okay. In the Foster the City community, everything I just described, we've had phenomenal foster parents who fit that demographic. We need more foster parents. Maybe that's something you could consider. I know that there are many of you here, though, that this does stir something up in you. And you're like, man, I wish I could do. I know that I'm not at a season where I can foster. I really wish there's something else I can do. I hope that Ryan's story encouraged you today. You could become a support friend for a foster family. Nationwide, more than half of foster families will drop out within the first year. And studies have shown us that the number one reason why there's dropout is because foster parents feel a lack of community support. And so this whole model we've created, that's for every foster family we raise up, we want to wrap them with at least 4 households that would provide practical, emotional, spiritual support on a consistent basis for a family. To be able to help, bear the burdens and share the joys, as the scriptures say. So maybe that's a role you could consider. If you're interested in getting involved in any way, you can talk with Lois and Julian, you can talk with Ryan, but you can also just come see us in the back table, and I'll have you fill out a next step card, and we are going to tell you about an interest meeting we have coming up. We've got them happening on Zoom. There's webinars you can jump into. We'll deep dive into these different roles, or you can join us for the lunch right after the service. I'd love to be able to hang out with you and get to know you and be able to answer any questions you might have. I need to wrap up. I'm sure I'm up on my time. We've seen the mandate to see and have compassion. We've seen the measure of love to which Jesus is calling us. But I've got one more thing I have to share, because if we just stop here, all that I will have managed to do up until this point is to put on your shoulders a burden that is probably too heavy to bear. When I've read through Luke chapter 10, if I'm honest, most of my life, I have, the story of the Good Samaritan does not liberate me. It doesn't inspire me to go out and live a life of compassion. Honestly, it feels like it crushes me. Who can love like this? Well, we've just been describing, like, who can do that? Let's be like, honestly, who can do this? So this felt like a crushing weight. Jesus says, go and do likewise. That's how he ends it. Go and do likewise. But who can do that? It's only recently that I'm beginning to understand, I think, another element of this parable that's helping to reframe this for me. And I'm still, if I'm totally honest with you, I'm still struggling a little bit to clearly explain this. Will you kind of lean in for a minute? Put on your thinking cap for a minute. I think the key to understanding this parable in full is to notice where Jesus placed the Jewish man in the story. Remember, the whole context of this parable is there's this Jewish religious leader who asks Jesus, who is the neighbor that I have to love in order to be saved? So he tells this parable in response to that question. Who is the neighbor that I have to love in order to be saved? Now, if Jesus would have responded to that question and said, okay, Jewish religious leader, imagine you are going down the road on a donkey and you see a Samaritan man beaten and bloodied and helpless and hopeless on the ground. I even want you to love him. I know that you look down on Samaritans. I know that it's dangerous, but I want you to get down in the dirt. I want you to move towards that Samaritan, give of your resources, put yourselves in harm's way potentially, and love. Even the Samaritan is your neighbor. If Jesus would have responded to the Jewish religious leader's question like that actually would have made sense. But he didn't do that. He put the Samaritan on the donkey. He put the Jewish man on the ground. He flipped it. Why? Here's why I think he did that. I think Jesus is saying, do you really want to know how to be saved? Do you really want to know? If you really want to know how to be saved, you have to see that you are the man on the ground. You are the one that is beaten and bloody and broken and helpless and alone and hopeless. And if you want to be saved, you need a good neighbor who would come towards you, somebody that you once considered to be an enemy, somebody who would come and get down in the dirt and reach out to you. You see, this religious leader, he had spent his entire life trying to justify himself before God through his good works, through his obedience, through how much he knew the law and the scriptures. He was trying to work his way to God. And I don't know about you, I so resonate with this. This is my bent as well. My natural bent is to try to earn my way back to God. Hey, God, have I been obedient enough? Have I managed my sin well enough today? Have I helped enough kids in foster care? Have I rallied enough foster families yet, Jesus? This is the thinking that I regularly have to combat. So much so, in fact, that every morning I pray this prayer. It's kind of a long, extended prayer, but a couple of the lines in that prayer, I say, God, would you help me to live with confidence today, knowing that there is no mistake that I can make that will cause you to love me less? And will you help me to live with humility, knowing there is no accomplishment that will make you love me more?
I have to pray that prayer every single morning. Because every single morning I wake up with this bent that I have to work my way to God. And I need to remind myself of what's true. Friends, listen, Jesus is not telling this religious leader, and he's not telling you, and he's not telling me, if you want to be saved, you must become a good Samaritan. That's not what he's saying. I think what Jesus is saying is, I am the good Samaritan. I see you right where you are. And I'm coming toward you. I'm not going to keep my distance from you. I'm not going to keep you at arm's length. I'm going to move towards you. I'm going to get down in the dirt with you. Not just at the potential that it might actually, bring pain or hurt, knowing it will cost me my very life. I am moving towards you, and I am coming with my wine and with my oil. In other words, with my blood and my spirit. And I'm going to cleanse you. And I'm going to restore you. I'm going to make sure you have everything that you need to be healed. Friends, and when we get that, when we can finally see Jesus as our Good Samaritan, it's then that we can begin to become like our Good Samaritan. Because listen, please lean in. When we now see others now in front of us who are struggling and hurting and vulnerable and alone in need, we can't look down on them anymore. We can't be callous towards them anymore or uncaring towards them anymore. Why? Because we know that we're looking in a mirror. We can just say, oh, me too. When we see that we are just sinners, saved by grace and grace alone. Now when we see those in need around us, we can't help but move towards them in love. It's only by seeing Jesus first as our Good Samaritan that we can bit by bit become more like our Good Samaritan. You with me? Let me close with this. When I read a Bible story, whether it's Luke 10 or the others, I will oftentimes read the story and then try to see which character in the story do I resonate with? Where do I see myself in the story? Do you ever do that? Which character do I kind of resonate with the most in this particular season of my life, in this story? I told you I see Jesus, and when I read Luke 10, I see Jesus as the Good Samaritan. I can't help it now. At one point in my life, I was the man on the ground. But I'm not there anymore. He's picked me back, and he's bringing me back to life. Can I tell you who I resonate the most with right now? The innkeeper. Because right now, Jesus is bringing me people that he wants me to love and to care for. And just like the Good Samaritan with the 2 denarii, Jesus has given me all the resources that I need to be able to care well for those that he's entrusted me with. And just like the Good Samaritan, one day Jesus is going to come back and I'll have to give an account for how I cared for those with whom he's entrusted me. And I think the same is true for you. I've never had 6 teenage football players in my house. I've never had my house burned down, but I'm going to follow the footsteps of Bishop Blake, and I'm just going to ask that question: Who will stand with us for the vulnerable? Who will stand for those in need that come across your path? Would you pray with me? God, I pray that we would be those kinds of people. God, that we would have eyes to see those who are struggling and in need, and that this knowledge about you would not be abstract or disembodied anymore. But God, that we would live out our faith and an understanding of the gospel in love and in action and compassion. Would we see and be moved towards compassion? God, I pray for every person here today, and I pray, God, that you would just in their heart of hearts, even right now, would you put in mind how you might be calling them to move? Maybe it's that person in their workplace, a person in their home. Maybe it's getting involved with Foster the City. Maybe it's getting involved with another missions ministry here at Radiance. God, would you enlighten them to know how you're calling them to move, and would you give them the strength and the courage to be obedient? And just as I kind of wrap up even this prayer, I just want to just offer a minute or two for us to reflect. Just with every head bowed and eyes closed, I want you to do something with me for a minute. Like I said, I don't know most of you. I don't know your stories, and I know what brought you here today. Maybe you've been here at Radiance for a while. Maybe you're newer and you're just checking things out. Who is Jesus? What is Christianity? And maybe it's not the innkeeper that you resonate the most with in this story. Maybe it is the man on the ground. Maybe you are struggling and you're feeling hurt. For whatever reason, you're feeling alone. You feel beat up. If that's you today, I want to ask you to do something. Just for a minute or two, I want you to actually, with your eyes closed, in your mind, with your imagination, would you actually picture that scene on the road? That road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And I want you to see, if you resonate with that man on the ground today, I want you to actually put yourself in the scene. Imagine that you are that man laying on the ground. And you're hurting. Acknowledge it. You're hurting and you're struggling. You feel alone. And as you kind of imagine that scene, I want you to see Jesus, your good Samaritan, coming down the road towards you. And I want you to see him as he gets down and he comes towards you. How is he looking at you? Friends, you're not alone anymore. There's hope, and there's healing.